Whenever I play as the Vampire Coast faction in Total War Warhammer 2, I always find myself gravitating towards one type of unit, and building entire armies of them. This particular unit is, of course, the Necrofex Colossus. This hulking mass of broken ship parts and reanimated corpses are bound together to create a necrotic giant that forms a fearsome sight on the battlefield. However, even though this construct exists within the game world and within the pages of Monstrous Arcanum, it doesn't have a miniature for the tabletop game. But in this video, I plan on fixing that. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this guide, I'll be showing you how to kitbash a Necrofex Colossus. Being constructed predominantly from parts of shipwrecks, I of course needed a ship in which to base the kitbash around. Luckily, the Idoneth Deepkin have a perfect source of parts in the form of the Gloomtide shipwreck. But I also needed some additional wooden parts. These would come from the war machines found inside the stock collecting Skaven Pestilence. While I didn't have any need for the Plague Monks for this conversion, it made the most economical sense to pick up these machines in this set rather than separately. With the wooden parts of the ship sorted, I now needed some corpses. The corpse cart made the most sense here. With the pile corpses and the zombies pulling it, I would have plenty for the Colossus. The only thing left was the cannon. The biggest cannon that was readily available was the one found inside the Iron Blaster kit. I didn't need the whole kit here though, just the cannon itself. With all the parts collected, I could begin working on the conversion. I decided to begin with the legs. These would give the Colossus the majority of its height and also dictate the pose. To acquire the wood, I began with the parts from the Plague Claw kit and clipped away the parts required to build the frame of the war machine. The problem here was that the frames were already constructed, so as I only needed the individual beams, I needed to begin the work on separating them. For this, I predominantly used my saws. I made the cuts as close to the joins in the beams as possible in order to retain more length. After the beams had been separated from the frame, I then used a combination of my knife and clippers to clean them up. Carefully, I cut away any stubs of the beams as I shaved away the small spikes that ran along their length. Finally, I softened out the ends of the beams. I wanted them to appear as though they'd been worn smooth by the force of the ocean. This process was performed on both of the Plague Claw frames, which resulted in a total of 6 longer struts as well as a few smaller beams as well. While I was already working with the Plague Claw kit, I also took this opportunity to clip away the wheels from the sprue and remove the mould lines. By this point, I had a number of raw materials that I could use to construct the legs. The tricky part here was figuring out a way to attach them to each other while still maintaining a vaguely recognisable leg structure and a degree of stability. I also had to consider the scale of the final model. I knew I would need to scale it down a little bit from the game version in order to make it both feasible to build and ultimately playable. The closest model rule and size-wise was in fact the Kraken Eater flavour of Mega Gargant. I think the weapon options of this particular giant matched the Colossus the closest, as it had the longest reaching ranged weapon of the 3 types. So I'd be basing the construction on the scale of the Mega Gargant. The height of the Mega Gargant is around 19 centimeters tall, so my Colossus needed to match this. To keep the proportions the same while staying within this height limit, the legs would need to be around 12 centimeters in height. So I laid out a ruler and used some blue tack to create a rough mock-up of how the leg would be constructed. The Colossus in Total War features a crow's nest as a foot, so recreating this would not only allow me to stay true to the inspiration, but also provide a good, solid point to fix the finished model to the base. From this dry fitting, I found that one of the longer planks was a little too long, so this was cut in half and the dry fitting was continued. Now that I could see how everything was lining up, I could actually start to assemble something. I wanted to achieve a good solid starting point here, so instead of using a hollow crow's nest, I instead decided to bulk it out with some of the various wheels from the Plague Claw. To attach these together in the best way possible, I began by drilling a hole directly into the centre of each of the 4 wheels with my pin vise. I then threaded a length of 1mm thick wire through each of the wheels using some super glue and fixing them into place. To help further bulk out and strengthen the foot, whilst also giving it a slight crow's nest appearance, I used some of the small wooden planks that I had removed earlier. Some of these needed a little trimming and clipping to help improve their fit, but they were all attached using plastic glue. With the foot completed, I now needed to attach it to the leg. I took one of the longer planks and compared this against a small raised hub at the centre. I created a better fit against this hub by making a small indentation into the end of the plank. To make room for the wire here, I then drilled a hole into the bottom of the lower leg piece and trimmed down the wire so just a few millimeters were left protruding from the foot. Finally, these were all attached together with a little superglue. To help prop up this leg, I then glued one of the smaller planks diagonally between the top of the foot and the leg itself. Continuing with the leg, I next began the work on creating a knee joint to attach the lower and upper legs. The joint would be formed by sandwiching the lower leg between two planks, so I needed a hinge type mechanism to fix the sections together and to afford me some degree of posing. I started by drilling a 1mm hole directly through the top of the lower leg and the bottom of the upper leg sections, ensuring that they all lined up correctly. This hole was then expanded out by switching to a 3mm drill bit and a file, and then drilling the holes once again. Some 3mm diameter plastic rod was then glued into the lower leg before being clipped down. Finally, the upper legs were attached to the rod too. Whilst the glue was drying, I ensured that the upper legs were positioned as a slight angle, while still being completely parallel to each other. Now that I had one of the legs built, I just needed a torso to attach it to. This would be formed from the front half of the gloom-tied shipwreck. I began by clipping away the parts required to build this front half from the sprue before cleaning up any of those mold lines. Straight out of the box, it was far too big for my needs and so needed cutting down to size. Like the plague claw frames that I had already cut down, I used a combination of my saws and clippers to cut the frame down to size. The two halves were then glued together. With the hole glued, I could compare it against the leg that I had already built. But even after the adjustments, it still felt a little too big. So I continued to cut down the sides of the ship even further. This would have been much easier to do earlier, but sometimes you can't always get a feel for how things are going to look until they've been fully assembled. With the ship cut down to a much more reasonable size, I could begin working on the task of finding a way of attaching the legs to the torso. I started out by gluing the floor piece into the ship. Beneath this, I attached the ship's rudder. This was the perfect height and shape to be wedged between the floor and the bottom structure of the ship's hull, creating an upright beam that I could begin to attach the legs to. The beams that were being used to construct the legs featured round holes, which would normally be used to attach various axles and connectors. It made the most sense here to take advantage of this and use these as stronger and more adjustable attachment points. Fortunately, the axle section from the Plague Furnace kit contained this component. In its current form, it was a little too large to be easily fixed to the previously attached rudder. So I started by clipping away the smaller of the two sections along the middle axle. This was then cleaned up with my scalpel before finally being glued to the rudder. I gave the glue on this axle a chance to dry before attempting to attach the leg. The axle wasn't quite long enough, so I decided to extend it. I used my pin vise to drill 1mm holes into the tops of the upper leg plank and into the axles, which were in turn expanded out with a larger drill bit. Into the hole in the axle, I then glued some of the same 3mm plastic rod that I had used earlier and threaded the legs over the top of it. I then completed the attachment by clipping back the length of the rod. With the left leg completed, I could start on the right leg. I took another one of the plague claw struts that had been cut away earlier and drilled another 3mm hole into one end of it. I temporarily attached this to the pre-existing hole to the waist and then fixed the plague claw's catapult arm to the drilled hole to create a lower leg. But I didn't glue anything just yet. First, I needed to prep the second half of the upper right leg. Like before, I drilled and widened out an extra hole into one end of another strut, and then another hole into the waist axle. Into this, I threaded yet more 3mm plastic rod before assembling and gluing the whole of the right leg. This more simplistic structure resulted in a peg leg-like appearance, and while it looked a little more fragile at the moment, it would be strengthened and bulked out later on. With both legs attached to the torso, I had now used up most of my plague claw wooden beams. I needed some more for the arms, and so these were sourced from the frame of the plague furnace. I followed the same sawing and trimming techniques I had employed earlier, until I was left with a single separated beam. I had gotten a little bit ahead of myself here though, as I still didn't have a way of attaching these arms to the torso. Taking advantage of the axles from the kit and the pre-existing holes in the beams had already worked out quite well for the legs, so I did the same for the shoulders. I began with the remaining half of the plague furnace chassis from earlier. I sawed it down the middle, made a few slight trims, and then attached each of these beneath the upper deck of the ship. By positioning the axles outside the profile of the ship, I could use these as attachment points for the arms. After attaching these shoulders, I discovered another area of the model that would need to be tackled before I could work on the arms, and that was the copious amount of corpses that the Necrofex requires in order to become animated. It is these corpses that are the conduit for the Necromancer's powers, but I needed somewhere to store them. The floor was provided by the deck from the rear half of the Gloomtide shipwreck. It was too large to be attached directly, so I sawed away the centre planks to create two separate but slightly smaller halves. I made a few cuts to the length of the planks to allow them to fit better into the hull, and then glued them both to the torso, either side of the rudder. I had a bit of a gap between the two sections of the deck, so I decided to use this as an opportunity to add the mast from the shipwreck kit. I made a few slight trims to the base of the mast to allow it to fit better against the plague furnace chassis, and then I glued it into place. To help strengthen this attachment and to expand out the deck a little, I then added the middle section of the deck that I had removed earlier on. With the deck built, I could add my corpses. These were sourced from the corpse cart kit, which has the pile constructed from two separate halves. I began by comparing the fit of the piles between the deck. As there were a few protruding limbs scattered about, I needed to make a few clips and trims to help them fit better. In addition to this, I also flattened out the underside a little. The way I intended to add them meant that they were slightly angled back further than they would have been normally, so I trimmed and filed the underside flat. Once I was happy that both halves were fitting correctly, I then glued them into place. So, now that I had completed the structure of the torso, I could finally return to building the arm. Starting with the strut from the plague furnace I had already prepared earlier, I began sawing it in half just past the middle hole. These two halves would form both the upper and lower parts of the right arm. After trying out a few options, I ultimately settled on using one of the plague furnace wheels as the shoulder joint. It would fit against the axle nicely, giving me some vertical movement and would also allow me to bulk things out a little bit more. I began by drilling a 1mm hole directly through the upper arm strut and into the wheel. I added a little glue to the strut and then glued a length of 1mm plastic rod through both holes. I did this for two reasons. The first was to strengthen the bond a little, and the second was to add a little extra hobbled together detail to the model. With the first rod holding the strut in place, I then repeated the whole process a little further down the arm. Next up was the elbow joint, and like the knees, was constructed by drilling a series of holes and then widening them to about 3mm. One hole was drilled at the bottom of the upper arm, two in both ends of the lower arm, and finally one more into another, slightly smaller wheel, which would serve as the hand. But I didn't attach anything together just yet. I first wanted to build out the hand, and for the fingers I chose to use the rib cage-like spikes from the corpse cart kit. Not only are they the correct scale, but they also come in 5 per row. These were all clipped from the frame before being trimmed flat. To attach these fingers to the wheel, that would be standing in as a makeshift palm, I used, you guessed it, yet more pinning. I drilled 1mm holes directly through the base of each of the fingers and through into the wheel. 1mm plastic rod and plastic glue was then used to pin each of the fingers into place. Finally, the 3mm plastic rod was used to attach the forearm to the upper arm before finally attaching the hand to the rest of the arm, which completed the right arm, at least for the time being. For the left arm, I started by grabbing myself that iron blaster cannon from its sprue, but before I could do anything with it, I carefully shaved away the symbol at the rear of the cannon using my scalpel. Once the cannon had been cleaned, I liberated one final strut from the other half of the plague furnace's frame, using that same sawing and trimming technique as before. This strut was also sawn into 2 separate halves. The cannon also needed a few more adjustments here too. This involved removing a couple of the protruding struts from the sides and the exposed fuse. Once these changes had been made, I then glued the cannon together. To attach the beam to the cannon, I started by drilling through 3 holes from the top of the strut. Once done, I lined up the cannon beneath the beam and, using the pre-drilled hole as a guide, drilled into the top of the cannon. Into this hole, I then glued a length of 1mm plastic rod and left it to dry. I then repeated this process by drilling through the remaining 2 holes and into the cannon before attaching a couple more of the rods. This pinning technique, like before, would not only help to strengthen the bond between the 2 components, but it also helped to add a little extra detail to the model. The construction of the left shoulder and upper arm was performed in the exact same way as the right arm. I drilled the holes and added the pins to attach the shoulder wheel, and then pinned the elbow with some 3mm rod. And with that, the main structure of the model was completed, and I just needed to add some extra details. The first of these were some spikes. The Necrofex Colossus in Total War features a number of sharpened logs dotted about the giant, and the easiest way to reproduce these was some sprue. I cut away a few strips from old sprues and, using my clippers, cut the ends to a rough point. I then used my whittling skills and my scalpel to round out some of the rods and to help further sharpen out the tips. I repeated this process multiple times and attached them to various points about the model. They were quite useful to slot between some of the joints in the legs to help strengthen them out a little, whilst helping to recreate that original design. At this stage, I was a little unhappy with the way that the corpse piles were looking. Having them just piled up at each side didn't quite look right. So I used some of the remaining zombies from the corpse cart and linked up the 2 piles around the back. Once the arms had been added, these would make the corpse piles much more visible. With the corpse piles bulked out, I next needed some slightly skinnier corpses, also known as skeletons. These were taken from the Azurite Ruined Chapel set, which also contains a whole bunch of wooden struts that I could have used to build this model too. Once removed, I flattened out their backs a little and then attached them to the front of the figurehead and another 2 to the mast. The Necrofex Colossus isn't a mechanical being. It instead afforded movement by lumps of reanimated flesh wrapped around the joints. To recreate these sinewy lumps of tissue, I used some green stuff. Like always, I cut away equal parts of the yellow and blue halves and left that middle section alone to avoid any gritty lumps getting into my mixture. This was then rolled out into rough sausage shapes and wrapped around the various joints of the model. Then, using some sculpting tools, I scoured a series of lines along the length of the roll to create the appearance of sinew. I used plenty of Vaseline here whilst working with the green stuff to prevent it from sticking too much and to also help smooth out any textures too. I repeated this process across any points of articulation on the model. It helped to both strengthen and bulk up some of these thinner looking areas, as well as adding a little more detail to the model. Whilst adding the green stuff to the model, I approached it in stages, tackling one area and allowing that set of green stuff to cure before progressing to the next prevented me from accidentally flattening out any details as I handled the model. Because I had slightly angled the corpse piles back further than they would have originally sat, I was left with a slight gap between the corpses and the deck. This took away from the whole pile aspect, so I decided to pad it out with a little green stuff. I started out with various sized rolls and blobs of green stuff which were pressed into the offending gap. With my sculpting tool, I then teased the putty into rough, fleshy shapes. It didn't matter too much about getting these perfect, as once painted, their details would be harder to see. Once the corpse piles had been dealt with, I could attach the arms to their shoulders. After gluing, I then filled out the joints with even more green stuff. By this point, the green stuff work had been completed, and I was ready to add some smaller details to the model. The first of these were chains. The cannon was pinned to the arm, but it didn't look like it was supported quite enough. So I superglued one end of a piece of chain into place and allowed it to dry. This was then followed up by wrapping the chain around the supporting beam and the cannon a few times, before clipping the chain and supergluing the other end. To make painting it much easier, I then applied superglue along the length of the chain in order to fix it into place. This process was then repeated with a finer 1.5mm chain around the figurehead at the front of the ship's hull as well. And then finally, I continued with the larger chain around some of the Necrofex's joints. The very final set of details to add were, of course, the ubiquitous dead animal bits. I took a number of skulls from the Citadel skull set and glued these about the model. A few were also pinned to the sides of the hull and the arms using the same 1mm plastic rod that I employed earlier. And with that, the model was completed. I just needed to be attaching it to the base, with pinning of course, and given a suitably undead paint job, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Necrofex Colossus. I painted it in the same way that's represented in the game and gave it a Vampire Coast themed base. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the result. It's easily been one of the most technically difficult kit bashes that I've ever tackled. So much so that I even felt like abandoning it at one point, but I'm glad that I didn't. It was very time consuming and a lot of hard work, but I've created something that is quite recognisable as the Necrofex Colossus, and I'm very happy with it. I also managed to keep the scale fairly close to that of a Mega Gargant. Although I don't actually have one to compare it to directly, the size is close enough to be a good proxy on the tabletop. So, let me know what you thought about this build in the comments below, and if there are any other Warhammer Total War units you'd like to see me tackle, then leave me your suggestions for those too. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, Douglas Wilson, Daniel Dowling, Raphael Beruthi, Lyconian Primarch, and Casper Strand. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then your help is what keeps this channel alive, and is what allows me to build these different kinds of conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all the relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.